Hello, thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar about black terns. We are thrilled to have you join us to learn more about these fascinating birds with Jenni Fuller. My name is Sarah Howson, and I am the program coordinator for Detroit Audubon, an organization dedicated to fostering the appreciation and conservation of birds and the environment that we share. We could not do the work we do without our funders and members. So I wanted us to thank those of you who are members and supporting projects like these. Ava Landgraf, Detroit Audubon's research coordinator, is also assisting us today. Thank you, Ava. Some quick Zoom housekeeping before we begin today. You are able to control your video and microphone in the bottom left of your screen. We ask that you keep yourself muted so that we do not receive feedback from your microphones. You can open the chat box by clicking on the chat button on the bottom of your screen. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please add any questions that you might have to the chat. If you have any further questions, reach out to myself or Ava, and we will do our best to assist you. Now I'd like to introduce Jenni. Jenni Fuller is currently pursuing her MS in Conservation Ecology at the University of Michigan School for Environmental and Sustainability, SEAS, with her research supported by the Michigan Sea Grant. She is interested in understanding how changing climate and landscapes impact avian conservation. She is honored to have had the opportunity to intern and work with Audubon over the past 2 summers, conducting fieldwork and helping research Michigan's black terns. Prior to her endeavors at SEAS, she graduated from Hope College as a dual biology and geology major, and spent time working in Michigan coastal dunes, Midwestern forests, and the Florida scrub. Thank you and welcome, Jenni.
All right. Is that my cue to get started?
It is.
Awesome.
Thank
you so much for having me. It's really great to be here. And I'm excited to show you guys my presentation. So I'm going to share my screen so you guys can all see. All right. Can everyone see that?
It looks great.
Awesome. Okay. So without further ado, I'll get started. So my presentation, as you probably noticed from the title, is about black terns. And as you can see from the title, they're facing some trouble. So I'll be going over what's going on with the black tern populations, specifically focusing on Michigan and how lake level rise and storms are really impacting their nesting survival. So here we go. So the first thing I'm going to start with is some black tern life history. So if you've heard of black terns, this might be review, but if not, here we go. So black terns are a migratory shorebird. They're fairly small for a tern, and they're unique because they have black breeding plumage, hence their name. They generally in North America, which I'll be focusing on, breed up in the northern part of North America, and then they migrate down to northern South America and Central America during the winter time to feed. They're known as a shorebird, so they like to spend their lives close to either freshwater or to the ocean. They're also colonial, so they like to spend time nesting in large groups. Anywhere between 10 and 50 nests are their clusters, essentially. But the overall colony can be much, much bigger. And they're also renesters. So if a first clutch fails within a season, which usually starts in May and ends in August, they can actually renest up to 3 times usually. And one other thing to note, they have about 3 eggs per clutch. Sometimes they have 4. It's a little rare, but it does happen. And the chicks are precocial, so once they hatch within a few days, they're swimming around quite a bit. They're immediately very fluffy when they hatch too, so they're very, very cute. And they're very mobile, so they're fun little chicks. So other things to note about their breeding, they typically are in freshwater hemi-marsh, which is, as you can see in the left-hand picture, that emergent vegetation popping out of the water. They like to nest in those areas, and they actually use plant debris to build their nests. So they tend to be on these floating mats on top of water. So they're very aquatic. And so I'm going to ask Sarah to pull up a poll for you all. The first poll. So the question is, how long do black terns incubate eggs? I want to see what you guys think. Well, it looks like, oh, still getting some answers here. Okay. All right, so 21 days, that's the final answer, and you guys got it. Nice work. All right. So I'll close that. So I'm going to show a really short video just to give you guys a picture of what these birds are like in the field. They're really beautiful and their chicks are really cute, so I had to share that with you all. And this is actually in Wigwam Bay. This is not Lake St. Clair, which is the study site I'll be talking about. But the habitat's a little different, but it's similar in that they're really on top of the water. So it's very unique. And there's all 3 chicks. All righty. So pause that. Okay, so there is some concern for black terns, as you probably noted from the title slide, and just some general things. So globally, they're actually least concern, which is great. That's according to the IUCN Red List, but they do note that the overall population is in rapid decline. So that is very alarming. And I'm going to have another poll come up just to see if what you guys think is the Great Lakes drop in population. So Sarah, if you can pull that up, that'd be awesome. So the question is, in the Great Lakes, how much have black terns disappeared since 1991? All right, so most of you said 60%. The correct answer is actually 90%. So definitely a conservation concern that we have right now in the Great Lakes. So some possible reasons for this population decline could be lowered habitat quality. So in that picture in the top, you can see where it's titled Phragmites. Some of you may have heard of this. It's a super invasive wetland plant species that has really taken over a lot of wetlands throughout the US and especially the Great Lakes. And as you can kind of see in that photo, there's not a lot of other plants growing there. It's just Phragmites. So we call that a monoculture, where really just nothing else grows. It's super, super thick. And this is a problem for black terns because they really like that patchy vegetation. It helps them to take off from their nests. If you've ever seen a black tern, their wings are very, very long. So they really need that space to take off. And also just visibility from above. Sometimes when they're hunting, they need to be able to check on their nests to make sure nothing's around. And so that low visibility is really not great for the black terns. Other things are habitat loss. So if you look on the right-hand side, there is quite a bit of loss in Michigan, especially since the 1800s and along the eastern coast. So Lake St. Clair, which I keep referencing, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's in that lower corner there, has seen quite a bit of wetland loss over time. And one other thing that could be affecting the terns is climate change. So we're seeing a lot more fluctuation in lake levels, more severe storms, And as you know, these terns are nesting on top of water and really could be subject to those types of events more so than maybe a nest that's on land. But overall, the causes are really not that well understood. So that's what we're trying to figure out right now. So I'm going to go over the study region, which is Lake St. Clair Flats, and I'm going to pull up one more poll question. So Sarah, if you can pull that up. Super. So the question is, in what two Great Lakes states are black terns not endangered? All right. So the majority of you guys said New York and Wisconsin. That's a good guess. The answer is actually Michigan and Wisconsin. So Michigan is actually one of the stronghold states for black terns. So I'm going to close that. So a little bit about Lake St. Clair, knowing now that Michigan's one of those stronghold states for black terns, St. Clair is super important, or historically has been super important. It's historically been their largest colony. And in 2013, they noted there was around 600 individuals. So that's around 300 breeding pairs and around 300 or more nests. So that's quite a lot of birds. Lake St. Clair is also the largest freshwater delta inland in the world, and it's also an important bird area. So it's really important also for a lot of marsh birds and water birds like ducks and waterfowl and things like that. A unique thing about Lake St. Clair as well is that Detroit Audubon has actually been monitoring this site since 2013. So we have a lot of information about these black terns here. Some other things to note: Lake St. Clair Flats is undiked. I note that because it's not an inland wetland that is being controlled for lake levels. I say it's coastal in quotes. Lake St. Clair is obviously not the ocean, but it's a huge water body still. Even though it's the smallest in the Great Lakes, it's still really big. And so it's very exposed to natural fluctuations like seiche events, which is when basically the lake is sloshing back and forth. And so you have this rapid rise in lake level in certain areas. Also storms and things like that. You can have larger waves because it's such a big area. And overall, Lake St. Clair is dominated by three main plant species where the black terns are nesting. So that includes cattail, bulrush, which is a thinner, smaller reed, and of course, the invasive Phragmites. So let's see if I can move this. Okay, so this is a really fun image to look at because I pulled these videos up from 2013 and 2016, and then I have this photo of Ava over here in 2019. And it's really interesting to look at because you can see in 2013, there's Caleb Putnam, I believe. He's overlooking a nest platform, and you can see the water's up to his knees. And that was pretty common for nests back in 2013. And in 2016, we have Erin Rowan, another black tern researcher. She's holding a chick in her hands, actually. And when she was wading around in the water, she was up around to her waist. And in 2019, it's kind of hard to tell because there's a kayak in the way, but the water was pretty much up to our chest level in 2019 and 2020. So much, much deeper. than it ever has been, and that is including the nest habitat for the black terns. And just to show you guys what's going on across the Great Lakes, we're seeing this rise, and Lake St. Clair is no exception. That water is definitely rising. So that red line is the average, I believe, since the 1800s, and that blue dotted line is that increase over time. And you can see 2013 was record lows, very, very low, and around 2015, 2016, around average, and then after 2017, you're really starting to see that spike in lake level. So definitely something that could be affecting these terns. So I've come up with some hazard hypotheses to basically decide, what type of questions am I going to ask and what type of things do I want to look at as variables to see, how is this lake level change impacting these nests? So one of my hypotheses is that this increase in lake level is causing a loss of emergent vegetation habitat, so where those terns like to nest. And then as you also have deeper water where the nests are, you might have stronger storm effects. So it's deeper, and so those waves might have a stronger effect. Also, if nests are closer to the main lake, they might have greater access to things like underwater predators, pike, muskie, snapping turtles. We've actually seen chicks being eaten while we're in the field by a fish. So they definitely do opportunistically eat those chicks. And if they tend to hang out along those edge habitats between the main lake and the vegetated areas, those might be getting closer and closer together. Nests also may be more exposed to wind and waves the closer they are to that main lake area. And then also, as that habitat is getting smaller and smaller, they might be more constricted to the mainland or peninsulas and houses and things like that. So that could possibly put them closer to human boater disturbance, so those channels where all those houses are. And they might have greater access by terrestrial predators that we know of. Up in the corner, you can see a raccoon. That's actually on a Nest camera, which was taken in Wigwam, which is a different site, but we do know that they are an egg predator, and they certainly are in Lake St. Clair, and they are very capable of swimming, so it's possible that they could be an issue at Lake St. Clair. And also we have seen snakes in the field, and also we've seen snakes, the remains of a snake predation on an egg, so little puncture marks into the egg. So I'm going to quickly go over my research objectives to get you guys oriented at where I'm going with this. So the first one is looking at nest survival. So what nest habitat characteristics facilitate survival or failure? So what's going around the nest? What is the vegetation like? How much open water is there? Habitat change. So how have these characteristics around each nest changed since 2013? And then finally, how does that connect to that rising lake level? And are certain nests more able to survive storm events, which we know are getting more and more extreme, and these years are getting wetter and wetter? What nests are more capable of surviving? And are these lake levels making it harder for them to survive? So I'm going to go over the data collection very briefly. It's a bit technical, so I'll be as simple as possible. But we, since 2013, we haven't been getting a lot of field measurements specifically of what the habitat's like. So we don't really know the full story. We have the species of the vegetation, but other than that, we don't really know. And so something that's really great for going back in time is using aerial photographs and satellite imagery like you might see on Google Maps. This can be pretty helpful for figuring out what's gone on in the past. And another thing that's useful too is bathymetric maps, and that is looking at the elevation underwater. And so that helps us determine how deep was the lake back in 2013 around a specific nest. So it's really cool what kind of information you can get. So the variables that I've been collecting using these types of things is the distance to the main lake, the distance to open water, housing developments, and also looking at vegetation greenness. So plants actually reflect really highly in infrared. And so you can actually use these images from the sky to get that brightness and that greenness of the vegetation. Looking at the percentage of open water around nests and also different vegetation classes. So that really thick, how much thick vegetation surrounds a nest, or medium like cattail, or thin like bulrush. And then the really fun part is nest success. So that's when we go out and do weekly and bi-weekly checks on each nest. Sometimes we have cameras. You can actually see a camera in the background of one of those photos there. And when we check each nest, we want to see if we can get their nest outcomes. So whether or not the nest failed, whether or not it hatched, why it might have failed, even if we're lucky. And sometimes if they fledged, it's pretty rare, but if we can get that data, it's really great. We also try to get the nest age. And typically that's done with a float test. So we actually test how much the egg is floating in the water. And also using physical assessments. So chick weight can be really useful too for determining how old the chick is and then how old the nest it came from is. And then finally, I'm also collecting hazardous weather. So things like lake level, wind speeds, and air temperature. And all of this data is coming from NOAA, which has been really amazing. They actually have an incredible model called HECWIFs. And what that basically does is get these really, really detailed wind speeds and air temperatures and lake levels all throughout the Great Lakes, and especially Lake St. Clair. And what I'm trying to do with that is looking at these really extreme events. So when these storms are happening, and then whether or not a nest failed during that extreme event, and then how large was that extreme event. So I'll show you a blow up of these two crazy looking graphs. So there's a lot going on here. So I'll just generally kind of go over what they are. But the map on the left-hand side is all of the points that I used for these different nest locations. So all of those green points are different nests. The little blue dots are where the lake level points are that NOAA's collected, and the white triangles are wind speed points. So you can really see how detailed that information is. And I can rest assured it's probably pretty accurate. So that's pretty cool. On the right-hand side here, I have a very, there's a lot going on in this, but this is kind of just a way to see the story of every single nest. So in that top area here, we have a group of nests in 2013. And along this axis down here, we actually have time. So this is all days across the season. So like if you look at this top nest here, if it's green, that means it's an egg. And then if it's blue, that means it actually hatched. And then if it ends up red, like this nest here, that means that the nest failed. So not too many nests are documented to fail in 2013, but there were a couple. And what's unique about this, or what's nice about this, is I can see, if a nest failed and during that time frame that it could have failed, did that intersect with some event that was really big? Was the lake level jump really, really high? Was there a really strong wind that happened during that time? So this is a really fun way to look at what's going on with the nest story. And if you want to ask more questions or look at this later, just let me know. I'd be happy to look over it with you. So now for the fun part, I'm going to go over the preliminary results that I have. What I'm going to go over is just the significant factors that are related to egg survival, just for the sake of time. And I have this just in case you haven't seen box plots in a while, just as a refresher. So if you see these little dots, that means it's an outlier. It's just a point where it's not similar to most of the nests. these top and bottom bars, that's the minimum and maximum values that you could have. So let's say like with lake level, this could be a really, really deep nest. And this could be like the minimum, the shallowest nest that we have. This is where the interquartile range, that's like where most of the values are located. And then that middle line is the median value. Okay, so for our first significant result, start date was actually one of them. So this is just how many days into the season did a nest start. And nests that actually started later were more likely to fail. And you can see in this box plot here, the failed nests tend to be about, 5 or 10 days later into the season. And then the interesting thing too to look at is what's going on over the course of the years. So in 2013, it was generally around 20 days. And then it kind of increased over time, but the most notable thing is you can see that minimum and maximum actually getting larger and larger. So it's definitely a lot more variable over time into 2020. So that was very interesting to see. Another result is that greenness that I was talking about. So it didn't have too much of an effect, but it was significant. And hatch nests tend to be in a bit greener areas than the failed ones. And if you look at over time, in 2013, it was much greener. And then that greenness decreased around every single nest into 2020. And one possible reason for that could be this increasing lake level and more inundation, more water surrounding every single nest. The next one is interesting as well. So this is thick vegetation. If you remember me talking about Phragmites, that's considered very thick vegetation. Sometimes also thick cattail can be included in this as well. And what we found is that nests that were surrounded by more thick vegetation like Phragmites were actually more likely to fail by around 10% more. And if you look across years, you can see that after 2016, there's a lot more thick vegetation surrounding each nest, which could be an indication that these nests are getting closer to the thick vegetation that's along the coastline. That's typically where it is in that shallow area or shallower. Next is lake distance. So nests that were farther away from the lake were actually more likely to hatch. So that actually matches my hypothesis that the closer you are to the lake, the more exposed you are to things maybe like predators or wind or wave events, and you're more likely to fail. And this also makes sense across years, according to the idea that as you increase lake level, the nests are getting closer and closer to that main lake. And you can really see after 2017, when that lake gets really, really high, these nests are all much closer to that main lake. So definitely some telling results here. And then finally, water depth. This is probably the strongest results, especially across years. But nests that are surrounded by deeper water tend to be more likely to fail. And you can really see that increase in water depth underneath each nest, not just from the photos, but also in the data. And one thing I'll note too is that that underwater elevation is also increasing over years. So these nests are moving to shallower areas or attempting to, but the water is still getting deeper and deeper and deeper. So yeah, that's pretty wild. And then finally, looking at egg survival, it's pretty sad. So we've seen actually a 65% loss in known percent eggs hatched between 2013 and 2020. I've also included some unknowns here. So at minimum is the green bar, and the maximum percent eggs hatched is that dark bar if you include unknown nests. So that adds a bit more variability to our results, but over time you can still really see a downward trend in that hatching survival. And just from being in the field in the last 2 years, it's definitely been a stark difference even between those 2 years, and how much the nests are surviving. And then another alarming trend is just their overall population. So as I mentioned before, in 2013, there were around 600 individuals or 300 breeding pairs. And this has dropped all the way down to about 110 individuals this last year. So definitely something is going on to this habitat with that 82% loss in birds. So the last thing I want to quick go over is my model. So what this model basically does, it's a way of taking all of those variables I talked about and seeing if I can accurately predict if a nest will fail or exceed based on the habitat that it's surrounded by. And it turns out that all those variables I talked about do significantly fit into that model to do that prediction, except for NDVI, but it was still included. So still an important factor going on here. So it's pretty exciting to see that maybe we're getting closer to an answer about what's going on with these nests and why they're failing. Some more things on the horizon is finishing testing the hazardous weather events on each nest. And then also I'm working with Michigan Tech Research Institute to capture the vegetation structure. So they have been looking at Lake St. Clair for a while, since 2013 as well, I believe. And they've been using radar data, which I won't get too technical with, but it's able to actually get the height of the vegetation and the structure of the vegetation. So I can differentiate between really tall Phragmites or a mat that's just along the water here. And that might be a lot more important than that greenness that I talked about. So hopefully these results will go into management work in the future to help these black terns. And thank you so much for joining me on this little webinar talk. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you, Jenny. That was awesome. I don't think we have any questions. If anybody has any last minute questions that they want to plug into the chat, we can definitely answer those. But it was very, very thorough. So I'm not surprised that there's not many questions. It was really wonderful. Oh, okay. Why do you think nest success was lower near the Phragmites?
That's a good question. So one hypothesis that I do have is that when they're around that thick vegetation, the black terns have more difficulty with seeing their nests, so visibility. And also they just have a more difficult time taking off and landing from their nest if there's a lot of really tall frag around them. But, you know, we don't know the whole story. So that's just my guess.
And then this is from John. On the NOAA data, do you have access to all years or just 2013?
All years. Yep.
Okay. Let me back up a little. At what point does a species survival plan get created and implemented like what happened with the Kirkland's warbler?
Olive, I think this might be
I don't think we have an answer for that one. I think we are trying to make it happen sooner. We're really trying to push having conservation efforts before we get down to very tiny numbers in a population, but unfortunately that's just not how humans really work. We like to wait until the last second to try to save a species. So hopefully we can turn that around, but it does make it complicated since black terns are found throughout the US and Canada. It's hard for people to understand how much their populations are dropping and how much they really need conservation support right now. Jenni, could you speak more about mats coming apart and the effect on nests? And you could maybe touch on the platforms that we tried out.
Yeah, so mats are really interesting. Generally, mats are created by, I believe, ice flows and breaking apart those mats during the winter time. But it's not super well understood how they're generated. But we have seen as the lake has been increasing, the mats are starting to disappear. And the more mats that you have, the more protection those nests have, especially from things like fish and things like that that are opportunistic. When the chicks hatch, they tend to run around on top of the net, on top of the mats. And if they're swimming around, they're much more vulnerable to something underwater. Um, and yeah, we've definitely seen a decrease in that since 2013. And one other thing that could be going on too is, as you have more and more deep water, those currents underneath could have more of an effect on where the mats are going. It could be pushing a lot of the mats away. We just don't really know the whole story because we don't have all the data. But yeah, that's a good question.
How about what is the impact of mute swans? And if you,
Mhm.
I know a little bit from Erin mentioning it in the past. We are not 100% sure about the impact of mute swans, but I do know that there was a correlation just a correlation of the black tern populations decreasing at St. Clair Flats when a lot more of the mute swans came into the area. So Erin Rowan, who was working on this and is still working on this, was thinking that they could have an impact in some way, but we don't know for sure. And the mute swans are aggressive and can scare off other birds. So it's possible, but we have no proof of any causation. Is there a human component where we could help or hinder black tern nesting success?
Yeah. So I think one thing on a broad scale is knowing where to start preserving areas for them and preventing habitat loss. So, with Lake St. Clair, there's certain things that we can control and certain things we can't. We can control how much boats might be. You might want to go boating into a vegetated area. You might want to steer clear of that and make sure you don't disturb it. Or you could help removing Phragmites, or we could put out nest platforms, things like that. But there are certain things that we can't control, like that really, really high increasing lake level. And so in circumstances like that, I think, in the long run, we need to think about preserving areas that we can actually control the lake levels a little bit better, like diked wetlands. Wigwam is one of our sister sites, and it's actually been doing really well. And the lake level is definitely not as variable in that area. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit more, but it's tricky.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions. Many variables seemed not significant by itself. I assume your conclusion that they mattered was part of GLM. I think that stands for Great Lakes Management, but I'm not sure.
So it's a general linear model. Yeah. So they were actually significant individually, at least the ones that I showed you. But there were a lot of variables that weren't significant that I didn't include in the results that I determined weren't significant because of the GLM. I don't know if that makes a little more sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that answers the question.
Yeah.
And Rochelle is asking, will research methods change for Ava with this new information? I don't think our research methods will change too much, but I think how we analyze the data might change. We'll be able to continue with some of the research that Jenni's been doing. Yeah, we'll add a little bit more so that we can keep up with this research that Jenni has started. Do you have anything else to add to that, Jenni?
Not entirely. I think even without me entering into the picture, a better understanding of nest age has been improving quite a bit. And I think if we stay on top of that and make sure that we know when nests started, that can really help know what happened to nests, possibly in terms of storms or things like that. And just making sure that we revisit nests frequently enough to know what happened to them.
Next question is there any help from our Canadian friends and their conservation groups, data collection, etc.?
I would say yes. I think Ava, you might have more info on that.
Yeah, we work with a Canadian group that we partner with. They helped us with some of the geolocator and nanotag work that we were doing. So yes, we do work very closely with some Canadian partners. Unfortunately, when 2020, due to COVID-19, they were not able to come out and visit this site. But normally they do come out and they help just with some of our data collection methods and some of the migration research with the nanotags and geolocators. The next question we have, could artificial nesting mats be manufactured? I know they're used in conservation of other endangered waterbird species.
Yeah, so I think Ava and I especially have been talking about this a lot. How are we going to save the black terns right now? Because so much of the mat is disappearing. And this last year, we tried out using nest platforms, which are a bit smaller. They're actually smaller so that larger animals won't step on top of them, which they tend to if they're too big. But they weren't really successful at all. And I think it is because they really just need large mat areas. So that is a good question. You know, we've talked about maybe using hay bales or taking a bunch of Phragmites and trying to put out artificial mats. So that's something that we're talking about for sure. And hopefully we can get something to work.
Yeah, we tried tried some nesting platforms and they showed no significant success. That was really heartbreaking for us. Jim is asking, doesn't Canada provide the Motus towers? I'm not sure if they actually provide the Motus towers funding wise, but the nanotags that they work with use the Motus towers, and I believe there's a couple Motus towers installed in Canada. And then there's one more question back from the top. There was some questions about Phragmites and whether it is exotic. Yeah, exotic or versus invasive versus native and all of that. Can you clarify that, Jenni?
Yeah, so Phragmites, I believe, is from Eurasia. So it is exotic. Yeah. It's not from North America, and it's definitely invasive.
Yeah,
so,
it is.
Yeah.
Bad.
Yep.
Yeah, it is. It is. That one's exotic, but it's interesting. The cattail that we see some problems with is a hybrid species between the native and non-native. So that one's kind of interesting because it's not exactly an exotic plant, but it's still very, very invasive and really causes problems. And John is asking, have you casually recorded similar changes in the Forster terns as water levels have changed? What do you think, Jenni?
Well, I've only been in the field for the last 2 years, so I don't really know. You know, my sense is I don't recall as many Forster terns in 2020 as 2019. There was a whole area that was completely washed away in 2020 that I believe the Forster terns were in. It was around, I think, I can remember correctly, Canoe Highway. If you know where that is. I mean, of course you know where that is. But that's the only place that I can think of off the top of my head. That's an interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah, we've been trying to keep casual records on the Forster tern nests in collector, so that if we look back, we might be able to identify some patterns. But we have seen a couple things have made me feel like the Forster terns are possibly out competing the black terns because they're bigger and more aggressive. And so with the limited good nesting mats that the Forsters are able to take those mats, and then the black terns are stuck with the real wimpy ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, John is saying, I remember a lot of the Forsters in the first couple years with Caleb and just noticing not as many. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know if they were decreasing a ton, but we could ask Erin because she's been out there every year, at least a couple days. And then backing up back to Modus towers, Erin Parker from the Detroit Zoo said Canada was supposed to provide Modus towers, but couldn't get them installed pre-COVID. The Detroit Zoo is partnering with Great Lakes Audubon to let them use our Modus towers on Belle Isle for some of the black tern nanotag work, since we already have a tower in place on the Belle Isle Nature Center. Yes, thank you for that clarification. Yeah, we have one of the Modus towers is at the Belle Isle Nature Center, and that is super helpful for us. Jim is saying there are Modus towers in St. Clair Flats. Maybe the Canadians were going to install more, but I think there are at least 2. Yeah, I know that there's at least one Modus tower out at St. Clair Flats that we were having some technical difficulties with. And I think our possibly last question, are you working with or sharing data with any state environmental agencies regarding this project?
I think part of that might be up to Audubon.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, I think that seeing these results now, it might be a good idea. So something that could definitely be in the works.
Yeah, we're definitely trying to work and share data with anyone we can. And we work very, very closely with the St. Clair Flats DNR group out there. And they kind of have connections with other state environmental agencies. So that's our connection, and hopefully things will be taken seriously enough that we can start doing something big to actually affect these populations and provide this prevent this very drastic decrease. So yes, DNR is a state agency. We are working with them very closely. Okay, I think that's all of our questions. Yeah, we look good. Thank you so much, Jenni. It has been wonderful working with you. I am so thankful to have you as a partner, and your research is amazing. I will pass it back to Sarah to wrap things up.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Jenni, for your wonderful presentation, and Ava. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We hope you enjoyed everything. And coming up in January, we do have a webinar highlighting the history and birds in Elmwood Cemetery on January 19th. We list all of our webinar schedule and field trip schedule on our website and on our Facebook page and in our Flyway Express e-newsletter. So please look for them there, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.